Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Matt Crumpton. His last name is spelled Crumpton, and he operates the Solving JFK podcast. Really well done, very well researched podcast. Kind of like a fresh look and looks into the cases and certain issues regarding the JFK assassination on a episode by episode basis. So I'll put a link to that podcast in the show notes. He's also in a book that just came out, and the title of that book is The JFK Assassination Choke Holds, that proved there was a conspiracy, and he's in there with James DiEugenio and a couple other authors. So you can check that out. We can cover a little bit about that. And then he's also in a new movie that came out, and I have not watched it, but I need to check that out. It's on my list of things to watch. The title of the documentary is JFK, What the Doctor Saw. So he's in that. He's been very busy. So I'm delighted to have him just 2 days before the 60th anniversary of JFK's assassination. So, Matt Crumpton, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I appreciate it, William. It's good to be here, man. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Cool. And I really like your style and the way that you put together your podcast. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your background for people who haven't heard your name and kind of what led you up to doing all this work on JFK.
Sure. Yeah. I'm an attorney by trade, and I just try to approach this case in the same way that you would approach any other criminal case. I'm not a criminal attorney by trade, but I was a litigator, and that's kind of how I approach it. Specifically, I always want to know, what's the citation. People, once you study this case, people always come at you with different theories, this and this. Okay, wow, that sounds very interesting. What are you relying on for that? That's always what I'm interested in. What's the citation? So.
Right. And so there's a lot. Like, I think when your podcast, you kind of work against the Warren Commission as its statement. So you're kind of saying, what did the Warren Commission's report get right or wrong? And it's kind of a step-by-step basis. And kind of what, and that was the Bible like. I think it's almost like an encyclopedia of information. What was it like kind of working off of that?
Yeah, the Warren report is I mean, the problem is it's just such a huge case. And what I saw out there, the reason that I took the time and actually did this podcast is because I was just surprised that no one else had done it in this format, in this matter, in this way. There's a lot of like individual episodes for podcasts, but there weren't any that was really going issue by issue, comparing what each side had to say. I later learned that there actually was a guy named Jeff Crudell, JFK, The Enduring Secret. He was kind of doing something similar. And by the way, Jeff and I have become good friends now, which is actually really cool to see. But at any rate, I just wanted to put it out there point by point, because I thought I had, really had my head around what was going on. And I thought it was absolutely clear that, like, look, this is a conspiracy. We got to figure out who did it. We got to have new hearings, all these things. And then I went on to these Facebook groups. This is during the pandemic, as I just sort of dove in more, and I saw that there is vociferous fighting over all of these issues, and they're still disputed. And I think sometimes, if you land on the Warren Report critic or conspiracy side of things, it's easy to just bypass the other side and write them off. But the reality is that you're going to have to refute their points, and they make good points sometimes. And sometimes, you may need the rest of their information for what they're saying to fine tune and sort of triangulate the truth, really. Right. So anyway, that's kind of my approach. And I get attacked for, I get called a Fed because I even discuss, what other people are saying. And I get called, obviously I end up landing on the Warren Report critic side substantively, especially as it relates to the medical evidence in season 1. So I get all those names too. So it's fun.
Right. Yeah, it's a passionate community, the JFK researchers, I would say. And there's still guys out there kind of supporting the Warren Commission line. I think one of the guys just put out a book recently. Litwin, I think was his name.
Yeah, Fred Litwin. And I would love to have them on. I tried to actually set up a debate between DiEugenio and Posner at first. I never reached out to Fred Litwin about that. but Posner never got back to us on the debate side of things. But I think I think it's good to have an open dialogue, and I think it's good for people to talk to one another. And if you go on some of these Facebook groups, it kind of ends up looking like politics. It's just like pure hate and disdain for the other side. My whole thing is like when I do start to have people on the the Posners and Fred Litwins of the world, I'm much more interested in clearly articulating exactly what we disagree about, rather than trying to convince or persuade one another. Because I don't think some of these people are persuadable anymore. But it is useful to figure out what where do we part ways? What inference am I inferring something, and you're inferring something different from the same set of facts that we're looking at, right?
Right. Right. So it's still going on. And when you you went down the piece by piece, small, 30-minute episodes, did you kind of discover stuff? Was it kind of a path of discovery, or did you kind of know what you're going to put in that?
Sure. Well, I I'd been reading these books for about 20 years and sort of studying. I did read Case Closed when it came out. I read JFK and the Unspeakable. I read Diogenio's book Reclaiming Parkland, and a bunch of other ones here and there over the years. Accessories After the Fact, The Last Investigation, Gate and Fonzie. But so I went back and I realized, look, if I'm serious about doing this in a legal way, I need to have like a legal outline, and I need to have my citations all in an outline. So I reread a few of the core books, and made an outline for that. And then what I would do is I would try to find the arguments for both sides. So a lot of times I would go to Bugliosi, go to his index, and find what he had to say about something. If I thought it was like, hey, this fact looks really good for Warren Report critics, what's Bugliosi say about this? Sometimes he had a good point. A lot of times he didn't have a good point. So I constructed an outline that had the arguments from both sides in it, and then I would put the episodes together from that outline. And when it came time to actually put the episodes together, I would realize, wait a minute, this all hinges on this one little tiny thing. Let me go spend 3 hours going down that rabbit hole when I thought I'd already come up for air. But that's kind of my general process. And then people email me things, and I put that on an outline too. And I try to just not lose any of the information that's coming at me,
Right. And you're kind of in an advantageous time to look back at it because there's been so much research pro and con. And you mentioned the government investigations. Sometimes those are overlooked. Am I
Right.
talking about those?
About the government investigation?
Yeah, like Church, Rockefeller.
Yeah.
I mean, Warren, we obviously talk about.
So, you get the Warren Report you get the Warren Commission that led to the Warren Report. Then you have the stuff Garrison was doing in New Orleans, which we'll cover this season on the podcast. And then you have a little after that, you have something that people almost never talk about, which is the Clark panel. If you're familiar with the Clark panel,
I don't even know what that is. No.
Ramsey Clark, the Attorney General under LBJ in 1968, I believe, put together a panel of 4 doctors who looked at the autopsy evidence, and basically they looked at the pictures and the documents from the autopsy. That's all they looked at, and the X-rays, and they concluded that the bullet that struck Kennedy's head was not at the bottom of his head like they say in the Warren Report, and like the doctors in the autopsy say. Instead, it was 4 inches higher at his cowlick, and they say, oh, there's a photo of it. I don't know how these doctors missed it. So that movement in the Clark panel, of which Bugliosi referred to as, what, you mean the 4 inches?
Wow. He dismissed it like that.
But that's what the HSCA would go on to rely upon. When the entire time the original doctors, Boswell and Humes, were vociferously against the HSCA panel. So when someone says, hey, I'm certain that Oswald struck Kennedy in the head from behind, the question is, well, which are you, the OG Warren Report guy? Do you believe with the doctors, or do you believe the Clark panel revision that the HSC medical panel agreed to, with the exception of Sarah Wecht? But anyway, then it moves on to, the Pike Committee and the Church Committee. That was great for finding out, in particular, about the CIA's ties to the mafia when it comes to trying to kill Castro and other mafia ties. And I'm going to dive more into that as we get going. The bodies of evidence that I'm the most familiar with are the ones that I've done the deep dive on. And so pretty much the medical evidence, the ballistics, the fingerprints, all the timing, all the JD Tippett stuff, all those crazy things. But when it comes to the mafia and the CIA, we haven't really gotten into that. A lot of that's going to be season 3. Season 2 is Who Was Oswald Really? So as it touches upon him, we'll be dealing with it. But back to the government investigations, probably. So the HSCA was interesting. It determined that, hey, there was the HSCA's determination was the Warren Report was correct, except that there was also a shot from the front that missed, and we don't know who did it. Have a nice day.
Oh, I didn't know that. So it's the House Subcommittee on Assassinations, right? That was mid-70s.
Yeah, House Select Committee on Assassinations, 1978. Basically, it was the result of Robert Groden and Dick Gregory showing the Zapruder film on Geraldo in 1974, I think it was. They ultimately set those events into motion. But the HSCA did create some really good evidence, and there were some really great investigators in the HSCA, like this guy named Gaten Fonzie. That basically, if you look at the HSCA files, and especially a lot of the declassified files, it turns out that was an interesting investigation. But the acoustics that it's based on have been somewhat undermined, I will say. I don't have like strong opinion about it necessarily, but there's an expert on the other side that says, hey, these acoustics are no good, and oh, by the way, the cop that you're relying on the recording for may not even have been in Dealey Plaza at the time. So there are some question marks around it. And the biggest thing is, like, they just rubber stamped the Warren Report and then threw a conspiracy on top of it. Like and when you read the accounts from people who were involved in it, it becomes clear that the conclusion of the HSCA was a political document, because a lot of people wanted a real investigation, and a lot of people were going to stop a real investigation at all costs. And so they basically, the compromise was, let's do a little bit of investigating and say that the CIA lied about covering up their relations to organized crime and attempts to kill Castro, but otherwise we don't know. There's probably a conspiracy.
Right. It's kind of like a limited admission, but not too much. Not too many names. Yeah, limited hangout, as they say.
Yeah.
But there were also kind of suspicious early demises of people around the 70s. So even this arc from 63 to
during the HSCA, a lot of people died that were involved in the case. Johnny Rosselli was found floating in a steel drum and on the ocean. And who else? George de Mohrenschildt was killed. I think right shortly after he was contacted by an investigator, by Fonzie, actually, Gaten Fonzie.
There's a really interesting exchange between him and Poppy Bush. It's almost like he's pleading for his life in the Family of Secrets book.
George de Mohrenschildt writes a letter to him saying, "Hey, we're good, right? Like, no one's, what can you?
It's almost like there's a sense of supplication in that letter. Almost like,
sure.
I'm on board. I've not done anything wrong, but almost it's subtextual. It's really an interesting letter. It shows how subtle of a thinker he was.
Yeah, we'll talk about George Bush eventually. I'll certainly cover him in season 3, I would imagine. But I think that my opinion is, like anything else, if you're certain that he's involved or whatever, you should listen to the arguments of people on the other side. And if you're certain he's not, the same thing. Like, you should just examine the information. All right, but then back to the government investigations. The ARRB is the last one, Assassination Records Review Board, which was created as a result of the JFK Records Act in the wake of Oliver Stone's movie JFK. And that one is basically what's responsible for all the documents that we have throughout today. And it's also responsible for these incredible depositions that took place when folks on the ARRB were able to call in any witnesses and depose them and subpoena them and ask them questions about their original testimony. And especially as it relates to the medical evidence, there's some fascinating stuff in the ARRB. These items are pointed out in the film JFK Revisited, which was the script of it was written by my friend James DiEugenio. That's the Oliver Stone film that
came out, right? Didn't it come out in the last couple
of years ago? Yeah, but they really go over all the ARRB stuff, and specifically, what we find is that John Stringer, the guy that took pictures of the autopsy, the official autopsy photographer, he's shown pictures of the brain, he's shown the autopsy photo, and he straight up says, "These are not the ones I took. I know this because we don't take pictures of a brain from the bottom. We don't take basilar views. This is a brain. This is a view from the bottom. Also, the one that I took was sectioned. It was all cut up. This one looks like it's perfect. Also, the one that I took, it was all blown out and the cerebellum was blown out, and this one looks like it's pretty much intact. Also, I used Ansco film, and this is a different type of film altogether."
Wow.
Same thing. Sandra Spencer, they interview her. Her job is she was responsible for processing the film used in the autopsy. She brought the type of film that she used to, the paper that they were printed on, with her to her deposition because she had extra somehow, right? And she basically was able to lay out as to how this is printed on different paper. The type of paper I used was this other type of paper, and no, these are not the same photos. She said the same thing that that John Stringer said. So they're two of the key witnesses in the ARRB.
That indicates that there's even more deceit involved in the record keeping than maybe people knew up to that time.
Well, here's the case in a nutshell. I'm going to give you the case in a nutshell, and it's more complicated than this. And people that know a lot about it can rightly criticize me, but I will defend my point still. It really comes down to, it's a lot of questions. There's 1,000 issues, literally 1,000 disputed issues. But the way to summarize it is, what's more likely? Is it more likely that the Parkland doctors and a lot of the professionals at Bethesda, a total of 43 people whose initial statements were that he had a big hole in the right rear of his head? Okay. So that's on one side. We have 43 people saying the same thing in their initial statements. Okay. On the other side of the ball, we have the autopsy record and the autopsy photographs and x-rays. It's not possible for both of those things to be true. There's not a possible, because in the autopsy, it shows that the back of the head is fully intact. Fully intact. The autopsy says that the side of the head was blown out up here. It was just this, right? So, but the problem so it just comes down to, what do you believe? Like, kind of, where's the Occam's razor on that one? And to me, I go, wow, 43 people all said the same thing. It sounds like they're probably right. But if that's true, I would expect there to be some proof of fraudulent autopsy. If the autopsy is not true, like, you can't just say this government record is not true. Is there any evidence that it's not true? And the answer is yes. John Stringer, Sandra Spencer. There's a guy named David Mantic. He's a radiologist, oncologist, physicist. He's got a lot of PhDs. And he has this device called an optical densitometer. It's an X-ray device that lets you see the density of bone based on basically how bright it is in the X-ray. And he took that to the National Archives to look at the original X-ray that they have on file there. And by the way, it might be a copy of an X-ray, but whatever it is they have on file at the National Archives. And the optical densitometer showed that the bottom right section of the head was like 2,500 times brighter than any other section, such that like it was too dense for it to have been real, because bone could be that dense. And same thing, he took a stereoscope and looked at the photos of the back of the head, and a stereoscope basically makes a photo be in 3D. Okay, and that photo was not in 3D; it was flat at the back of the head in this one little section, which appeared that like there had been a matte insert of hair where it was really blown out. So, that's just one guy talking. So what I expected when I went to Vincent Bugliosi's index for Reclaiming History and I looked up David Mantic, I expected Bugliosi to point me to another expert who has countered David Mantic and said, no, he's wrong. That's not what an optical densitometer tells you. And, I expected there to be like an argument. You got one expert, let's say an expert on the other side. And Bugliosi's comment on David Mantic, the only thing he said in his book about Mantic was he's a very, very smart guy. He's won all these, awards. He's a brilliant physicist, and this is his job, is to study X-rays, and he would be the guy that would know about this. But so he praises him for one paragraph. In the other paragraph, he just goes, but if you believe that there's a conspiracy, you're already crazy, and you're going to believe crazy things, and I don't know how to help you. Like, so the point is, he doesn't address the substance. And once I saw that, I was like, wow. So there you go. That's what it comes down to. Is it the Parkland doctors or is it the autopsy? Which one's right? And there's nothing that shows that the argument against the Parkland doctors is, hey, their job wasn't to do an autopsy. And we have people whose job it was to do an autopsy. But, if you have 43 people all saying the same thing, maybe that's true. Maybe or did they have a mass hallucination?
Right. But that was also right at the time of the assassination too. So it was like a first blush. Yeah.
Yeah. And some of them later will go back and change their statements, but what are we to believe? The first thing they said or the thing that they said later when they were spoken to by others? You know what I mean?
Right.
And there's specific examples of specific people that are Elmer, I believe his name is Elmer Todd. No, Elmer Moore. Elmer Moore is the Secret Service agent who allegedly confessed to some other guy, to James Gokenauer. And James Gokenauer came forward to the HSCA to say, Elmer Moore told me that it was his job to go to Dr. Perry and tell him to be quiet. And, of course, Elmer Moore came forward to the HSCA and said, no, this guy's lying. Right. So then whatever. Then there's another guy named Donald Miller, who Dr. Perry worked with at the University of Washington years later, who said that Dr. Perry did tell him that Elmer Moore pressured him to not speak anymore on behalf of the Secret Service. So it was, so it just comes down to like, now, if you're someone who doesn't, who believes the Warren Report, you just completely write off all these people as crazies. And that's your game. You stick on it and you go, liar, I'm sticking with the other people because it's probably not true. And if I continue to just reflexively assume everyone's lying and everyone's in it for a book deal, even if they don't write a book, then it does make things cleaner and easier, I will say.
Yeah. I mean, some people I think that there's some disingenuous people in the JFK research community who are there for some other reason that may not be honest. Like they don't have an integrity to listen to some of these other voices on so many matters too. Like they discount so much evidence, so much firsthand evidence and stuff like that. I've seen it over and over again. So this was what is like all of these doctors talking is what is contained in JFK, what the doctors saw.
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I'm very lucky to be in this. I mean, I'll say like there are so many people who have been studying this case longer than me, that know more than me, that I'm sure would have loved to have had a chance to appear in a big documentary like this. And I just got lucky. Like the lady that was the director, Barbara, she was looking for podcasts while she was going on runs, and she came across my podcast, and it's that simple. And she reached out to me. So that was pretty cool. I went to Cleveland and filmed for a day, and and just kind of talk through a bunch of stuff. But what they have is original footage that has never been seen before of a reunion of the Parkland doctors from, I want to say, the 90s. Might have been early 2000s, but most of them were still alive. And so we take that and put it with a bunch of other footage, and then have myself and a couple other people explain the context versus Bethesda. So you have Parkland on one hand, and then Bethesda on the other hand. Parkland is, hole in the back of the head. Bethesda is the
Maryland.
whole
Yeah, that's the what hospital is that? It's
That's
like a military hospital, right?
Yeah, it's the Bethesda Naval Medical Center.
No, that's right.
But what's the thing about that is, okay, if the shot if it really blew off the front of his head, like the X-rays show, for example, and think about the trajectory, whether it's coming in the back or whether it's the Warren Report position or the Clark panel position, you pick your poison. But whatever it is, where's that bullet going to enter from? I mean, I think the idea is that it kind of comes on the side and then knocks out the side and whatever, and it's kind of unclear. But the point is, there would be a noticeable damage to the front of the president's head in front of his ear. Okay, like in the end, that's one criticism, big criticism I have of the idea that there was a shot from the back that was like the first shot. You don't see in those photos of the autopsy, the damage is all behind the ear. We don't see anything in front of his ear. So
interesting. So it's a lot. What was Barbara's motivation in making this particular documentary? It is.
I want to say that so she did a documentary on Ghislaine Maxwell. Okay. So she kind of does interesting type documentaries like that. She I want to say somebody at CBS came to her with the idea and the footage and said, "Hey, we have this footage. Can you put a documentary around it?" I think that's kind of how the conversation went. You know what I mean?
Interesting, right? Yeah.
But yeah, she's great, and I'm gonna have her on my podcast later this year. Cool. And honestly, her opinions were so good about the case and I knew which way she was taking it. I had genuine concerns that whether or not this was going to get to come out. And there was a period of time when it wasn't clear that it was going to get to come out. And they got it over the goal line for whatever reason. The people at Paramount Plus approved it, and they let her tell the story.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean that's definitely a risk, especially with some of these bigger operations.
It's Viacom, at the end of the day. And the only thing I have, so there's a guy named this is really funny. It's actually hilarious. There are two main people in the documentary that it's my job to moderate. This guy you see with the yellow shirt and the navy blazer, his name's Doug Horn. Mm-hmm. He's sort of like the conspiracy guy, all right? But he's not just some guy. He was the head of the military records for the Assassination Records Review Board. Okay? Wow. And he supports, and he was right there when all this stuff was happening. And he kind of supports some theories that, I think are a little more out there that people would argue, even though I agree with almost all of the things he's saying. There's one area in particular where I have a disagreement with him that I had to kind of highlight in the film. I'll come back to. And then the other guy is Dr. Michael Baden, who's the head of the HSCA medical panel. And he's sort of the official story guy. So she brought in me to be the guy in the middle who's like, well, there was a conspiracy, but it's not the way a conspiracy guy says it, and it's not the way that, and the official story guy is wrong. It's like, oh, you want me to tell Dr. Michael Baden he's wrong, and you want me to tell the guy who was there, who's responsible for all the medical records of the ARRB. Okay, we'll see. But Doug Horn, who I met this weekend, this past week in Pittsburgh, he believes that there was a helicopter that took the body in a cheap shipping casket from Andrews Air Force Base to Bethesda, while the bronze ceremonial casket went in a motorcade and took an extra like 45 minutes to get there. And that's when they had time to kind of like do some body alteration and stuff like that. And just zooming into the details on it, there's just no evidence for a helicopter. And so I'm just not, now there is evidence of an earlier arrival, okay? But it's not super clear. And my whole thing is like, I'm okay with there being some mystery. And I just don't want to, if I put my stamp behind something, I just want there to be absolute proof behind it, or some proof, something that I can point to and go, well, I think this happened. And the answer can't be because that would have had to happen if the other things in my theory happened. Well, you can't. Now you're just making things up. You just got to stick to the facts. That's kind of what I try to
Right.
focus on. So
No, but there is evidence that like the body was delayed and clearly tampered with and all that stuff. So that's
you've got Dennis David says that the body arrived in a cheap shipping casket that came in a black car. And there's also something called the Boyajan report that says that the body arrived at 6:35. There's just nothing about a helicopter. But I'm going to talk to Doug about it, and maybe I'm wrong. And if I am wrong, I will say it. But Doug's a good guy, and I was concerned he would be mad at me, but he's not. We're good.
What's your take on Tippett? Why did he get shot and who shot him? I mean, there's so many different stories I've heard, like Kerry Thornley or something like that. What's your position?
Yeah. Well, the Tippett case is interesting. You have the first thing that jumps out to me about the Tippett case is the timing. Okay, so people make a lot about the the distance of the walk from Oswald's rooming house to where Tippett was killed at 10th and Patton, and it's true that it's not the easiest walk in the world. I've heard some people say it's 18 minutes, 14 minutes. It's 8/10 of a mile. Okay, so you know how long it takes you to go a mile. So to me, it's about 10 to 12 minutes. Okay, maybe 13 minutes. So I don't think it takes as long as some people say. Okay, but the question is, how much time would Oswald have had available? Given the timeline that we know from the Warren Commission. Okay. So using their own timeline, he would have left around 103 or 104, according to Earlene Roberts, from the rooming house. But then we also have him arriving between 1 o'clock and 1:07 at the Texas Theater, according to Butch Burroughs. Right. So there's that. How can he be in two places at the same time? And then back to the Tippett crime scene, we got Helen Markham at about, saying it happened around, 11:06, 11:07. We got this woman whose name I forget at the moment, who looked at the clock that was on top of her television and said it happened. I'm sorry, not 1:06 or 1:07. This lady, she looked at the clock on top of her TV and it said it was, I want to say like 1:06. And then T.F. Bowley says that he came on the scene and he saw Tippett's body lying there and he could tell he was dead. And he looked at his watch and it's 1:10. Well, this is supposed to be 1:15 when Oswald shoots Tippett, but it looks like really it's 1:08. It looks like is the top between 1:06 and 1:08. And it's not possible that Oswald could have made it there if he left at 1:03 and he had to be there by 1:08 or even by 1:09. It's not going to get there in 6 minutes. Okay. So he could have gotten there in 10 minutes if he was walking quickly. Nobody saw Oswald, by the way, walking from Beckley to 10th and Patton. So that's another thing. And the people that did see Oswald claim to have seen someone who looked like Oswald actually say he was coming from the other direction. Okay. So so there's that part of it. You got the shells. I mean, the shells to me, there's been a lot of energy spent on. There's a couple of different shells, and in terms of the types of ammunition. I remember looking at that, but that one's not. I mean, the whole thing comes down to you've got all these people who identified Oswald in a lineup. Now it was a very unfair lineup. Okay. So, but what I come back to on Oswald is a couple things, really 2 points. For it to be possible that Lee Harvey Oswald killed Tippett, you have to completely disregard time. You have to completely throw out all the evidence of time, because it conclusively proves, if you're relying on people's watches to be accurate, then conclusively Oswald could not possibly have killed Tippit. It's not possible. Now the counter argument is, hey, it's 1963. It's not like today when everyone's phones are calibrated digitally because we're all on the same thing. People's times that their watches would have been off a little bit, and certainly that's true, right? But the question is, how far? How far do you take that? So if you're going to rely on time evidence at all, that's very strong for Oswald. But some people just totally throw time evidence out. Okay. Well, then what are we left with? He did have a gun on him when he's arrested, and the gun that's in evidence now has the same serial number as the one that they have paperwork for, right? So what has to be true if Oswald didn't do it then? Whoever did do it must have looked a little bit like Oswald, at least, because we got a bunch of people identifying that person. So must have had some resemblance to Oswald. And the other thing is, you would have to believe, and this is where it's tough on the conspiracy side. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying this is a big fact to swallow, to get like an average person to swallow, right? Which is, they would have had to have substituted the gun that's in evidence in the National Archives now for the one Oswald had on him. Because Oswald did have a gun on him, but he claims that he bought that gun elsewhere. Well, for that to be true, they would have had to substitute the gun out, which, who knows? Maybe that happened. All it takes is for them to have one person on the inside. So I'm just saying, like, what I'm trying to do is identify, like, what has to be true here.
Right.
If for you to believe that it's Oswald. And I go through in episode 27. Both sides have a list of things that are not the easiest to believe, that they have to believe in to be intellectually consistent. You know what I mean?
Right. But it's just a strange event in the whole, high strangeness of the JFK information, misinformation, disinformation thing. Is like, how does Tippit and Oswald factor into this whole thing? Because he clearly got killed. It's just like, why?
Well, here's another thing about Tippit real quick. The whole story is that Tippit pulled this guy over because he matched the identification of Oswald. Well, what's the identification? A 5'10" white guy. So you're gonna pull over every 5'10" white guy on the street? Okay. So, but anyway, let's assume that that's true. The problem is, the witness testimony for what they saw was that the man's walking down the sidewalk, car pulls up to the man. And so if this man is worried about being caught by the police, he'd probably keep walking, or maybe he would run, right? Or if he's really crazy, maybe he would just turn around and shoot the cop. What this man did is he stopped when the police car stopped, and he walked back to the car, and the car windows are down on the passenger side. The guy puts his arms on the car window and leans in and starts talking to this cop. And then the cop gets out of the car and walks around. And by the time, he's got out and walked around, the guy then walks over and shoots him a few times. So the point is, if you're on the run, it doesn't really make sense that you would go back to the cop, right? And then the counter argument to that is, Lee Harvey Oswald's a crazy guy and he's a bad guy, and you don't know what he's going to do.
Right. I'm not sure how that, but it seems like they knew each other. However that went down.
I think so too.
Yeah. But what you talk about the JFK, this book that came out? You've put out a lot of stuff this year. What do you, when you talk about an assassination chokehold, what are you referencing specifically that you think is in the investigation that is a chokehold?
Yeah. So this is a result of just the backstory in this book is that I went to my first JFK Assassination conference in Dallas last year. And while I was there, I ended up meeting pretty quickly and befriending James DiEugenio, Paul Blow, another guy named Mark Adamczyk, who's an expert on the JFK Records Act. He's an attorney. And we just kind of started the conversation of, like, what are the greatest hits of things that have been proven? Because some things are inconclusive. Some things we don't, there's evidence on both sides. If you're being honest, like, it's kind of a coin toss, right? So the question is, what are the things that are conclusively proven and they are inescapable, right? That's how we get chokehold from. Like, you can't get out of it. You can't, slip out of this one. Like, this has been proven. So, in terms of what those are, there are 10 of them. I want to say the ones that I wrote chapters on are for Oswald could not have been on the 6th floor at 12:30. And I also wrote another chapter for Oswald was impersonated. There's about 20 instances of people impersonating Oswald, right? And there's a difference between saying somebody gave this report and then afterwards they saw Oswald on TV and thought this guy was Oswald. That happens sometimes. It's another thing to say, no, this person was actually pretending to be Oswald. You see the difference? There's one's like a mistaken, a witness who may be wrong about whatever they saw. The other one is someone who's saying things to try to get people to think they're Oswald, right? So that happened a lot in this case. We just got to figure out why. I mean, if anyone listens to the podcast, Ralph Yates, we cover in episode 1, is like the classic example of Oswald being impersonated. So we talk about that. We talk about Oswald's ties to intelligence. I will say too, the podcast, I try not to talk about things that I have not yet covered in depth in the podcast because I don't really want to take a position until I've had that level of study. But there are some things in this book that, if I didn't write the chapter, I'm not, necessarily saying I believe it, although I'm sure most of this stuff's pretty solid. There's nothing in here that's false. I checked it for that. All the citations are in here. It's all that I'm saying is, for chapters like Oswald was intelligence. Oswald was connected to the CIA. There's a chapter on that. I want to unpack that a little bit more, so I'm not going to really comment on that, and we'll do that in season 2. But the problem,
he had a really fascinating life. I mean, he's dead at 24, but his
24-year-old.
background is remarkable. I think 15 is when he's pictured with Ferry. So he at least had some kind of 10-year relationship. Ferry was a really sus guy too. So I mean, it goes really strange. Yeah,
definitely. David Ferry was definitely a suspect. But in this Chokeholds book, probably the best thing about it is the last chapter, which I didn't write, so I can freely say that. But it covers all of the obstruction of justice in all the investigations, including the continuing obstruction of justice by President Biden and before him President Trump, and just following the JFK Records Act. They're straight up not following it at all. It's wild. They're just pretending that it doesn't apply to them. And we're trying, there's litigation right now trying to get, a judge to accept it. But so far there's still, about 4,000 classified documents. They talk about the case of George Joannides, this guy that was, so this is crazy. The guy who was assigned to the House Select Committee on Assassinations as the CIA liaison is also the guy who was in charge of basically coordinating the DRE, which is the Cuban student group that was having conflicts and altercations with Oswald on the street. So the guy who oversaw the Cubans on behalf of the CIA who were interfacing with Oswald, he's the one that the HSCA was working with to try to figure out that exact question. Who do we talk to about Oswald? About the CIA's ties to Cuban exiles. Like, can you help us, Mr. Joannides, find the appropriate party at the CIA? And he's going, no, I really can't. I wish I could help you, but I've looked and looked and I can't find it. And then they declassified documents recently showing George Joannides is the guy.
It's the guy.
He was lying. It was him the whole time.
They must just be howling and cackling at the CIA about some of their obfuscations. Like, they're so brazen. Right. And some of the cleanup jobs, like, clearly, I mean.
And that's another thing. Another thing with, like, the Fred Litwins and Gerald Posners of the world, who I don't want to say bad things about because I want to be cool with those guys, even though I know people don't want me to. Okay. I want to be able to have dialogue with people. I think it's helpful to have dialogue with people that disagree with you. But what I would say is, like, there's some specific things, especially you get into the medical evidence, they bring in their, the John Latimers, and they bring in all these different, they talk about yaw and all these different, they
Teaching
get
y'all and
lost
stuff.
in
Yeah.
a sea of details. But like, why would the CIA continue to have to hide all these things? Why would they have to interfere with all these investigations if there wasn't something to hide? And then, when you, again, like the John Stringers and Sandra Spencers of the world, David Mantics of the world, really hammer that home even more. Oh, and the brain, one more thing while I'm thinking about that. The brain that they had in evidence was heavier than the average human brain, and it was supposed to have been blown out and hit by a bullet.
Right. How's that make
Why?
sense? Yeah, it doesn't make sense at all.
Doug Horn thinks it's because it was a different brain. And okay, where would you get another brain from? What are you saying? They went and killed someone and stole their brain? No, it was a medical teaching university. They had a brain room with all these brains of cadavers. It was easily accessible.
Easily, yeah.
So anyway,
yeah. No, there's a lot there. I mean, you've put out so much this year, so people can go check that out. Put links to each one of your projects, podcast, book, and documentary. Do you have time for a few questions, Matt?
yes.
Okay, let's see. This one is Sabrina asks, wasn't the JFK murder investigated by the government in 1970 or thereabouts? Included there was a conspiracy, despite not coming around to any specific theory. I think we kind of covered that.
That's the HSCA, 1978, and again, it's a political document. It's a compromise. The conclusion is completely meaningless. The evidence itself that was generated is interesting and worthy of study.
Gotcha. And then Big J21, what do you think of the Garrison investigations?
I think that you got to look at all the information. So my friend Jim DiEugenio is a big fan of Jim Garrison, right? And obviously him and Fred Litwin have a big disagreement about that. Littman's got a whole book about it, On the Trail of Delusion is what he calls it.
Right.
So
I think John Barber knew Garrison, and actually, I think he re-put out a new documentary in the last week or two. So
I know
check that out too.
I know that there are a lot of famous researchers, like on the conspiracy side, who don't like Garrison. I know that what's her name? Sylvia Maher was not a fan of Garrison. I want to say like Harold Weisberg didn't like Garrison. There's a lot of people that, and I think what history kind of shows us is that, when you compare the attitudes of historical figures with the attitudes of people today about certain subjects, it's easy for them to look way out of step, right? Kind of when they were on the wrong side of history. So, for example, racism. This is a great, that really comes through. Now, Jim Garrison wasn't racist, and as far as I could tell, but he was what we would call today extremely homophobic, right? So, in other words, he enforced sodomy laws that were on the books. Like he would send people to jail for that, for sure, right? So there's that's an angle that
that's not far out of the sensibilities of that time. Sorry, people.
Well, and that's the angle that he's kind of criticized for, like, he didn't like gay people. He was enforcing sodomy laws, and that's why he came out. He came against Clay Shaw and David Ferry and these guys because it was really because they were gay.
Russo, because they're all gay, right?
Now I have not. I am going to cover that this season, and I have not yet gotten to it. But I think Jim Garrison uncovered a lot of information, and I also think there's evidence of in this Chokeholds book of some some obstruction by the CIA of his investigation. Now that's a disputed fact, okay, but at any rate, we'll be talking.
He got the treatment. Garrison got the treatment. Calls, threats,
right?
Threatened his family got involved. I think it ruined his marriage.
I would say
put his neck out. Yeah,
I would say I'm generally would consider myself on the pro Garrison side of things, but I need to look at the claims against Garrison to have the full picture. And by the time I do a podcast on what Garrison was up to this season, I'll be able to have a good like synthesis of what I really think.
What was it? His book was On the Trail of the Assassins, right? Wasn't that it?
Yes, On the Trail of
That
Assassin.
worth looking myself. I wouldn't mind reading through that.
Yeah, and I mean, it really just comes down to like, okay, Clay Shaw, did he have CIA ties? I mean, I think probably he had some ties, but was he the best vehicle? Probably not, but better than. I mean, it generated a lot of material for study. So that's
yeah, but that's true. But a lot was going down in New Orleans. I mean, that's where a lot of these guys were from. Ferry, Oswald's from New Orleans, so he was right there. At kind of like
Guy Bannister,
yeah, Guy Bannister's super suspicious.
Uh-huh.
So it was kind of like almost like a staging ground, almost for Dallas.
Right. We'll cover all that in New Orleans this season too. So that'll probably like January, February. We get into that. Probably February. I would bet.
And then Bobo asks, "What do you think about multiple assassins who didn't know each other, leading to anomalous wounds, like with the Prime Minister of Sweden?" Have you heard anything about that, or any thoughts on that?
This is really the argument of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, right? Oswald did it, and then some other random person fired a shot that missed from the grassy knoll. I don't think that that's credible. I think that it would be a plot, just given some of the other things that are going on. Plus, just the timing. What's the likelihood of that, right? What's the likelihood that they're going to do the shot at this exact location, and then someone else is going to incidentally fire a shot at the same time? So, I think it's probably unlikely. Is my view. I think
and then Jonathan
knew each other. Yeah. Also, there's walkie-talkies there that we see in Dealey Plaza. There's a guy that's got a walkie-talkie on the railroad. Obviously, there's the guy sitting next to Umbrella Man with a walkie-talkie, and Lee Bowers saw some folks driving around with walkie-talkies in the parking lot behind where the picket fence is, behind the grassy knoll.
Interesting. Jonathan asks, "I've seen a recent picture of an Armalite AR-15 rifle possibly used. However, it was not issued for the military in 1963. Does Matt know or is aware of that weapon being on the scene? Have you heard anything like that?"
No. I mean, you have three rifles that are kind of discussed. You have the Mannlicher Carcano, that's the big one that's on the Wikipedia page, that was found on the other side of the building. You've got a Mauser, which where was that found vis-a-vis the Mannlicher Carcano? Official story is there was no Mauser, but you've got Seymour Weitzman, who is a firearms expert, saying there was a Mauser, and then continuing to say it the same day and writing it in the same day affidavit. Same thing with Sheriff Boone. They said it was a Mauser, and it was reported widely it was a Mauser. But we don't have a Mauser, so that's just it is what it is. And then there was I want to say like the week before, Buell Wesley Frazier had brought his rifle into the depository for whatever reason, and that's sometimes discussed as being in the building. But no, I don't know anything about an AR.
Have you ever heard of like the whole story about the driver having a gun and shooting around? I think it was like a Bill Cooper thing. I don't know.
Bill Cooper talked about that. There's a guy named there's a book called Mortal Error, I believe. And it was made into a movie that's been on Netflix for a long time that basically pushes the theory that the Warren Report got it right. It was Oswald, except the headshot was from the Secret Service driver, I believe, Bill Greer. And he was turning around with his gun, and he accidentally fired the headshot that killed the president. And it was an accident, right? But the problem with that is you can talk about I mean, I'm really digging into this to give an answer to it, right? I mean, let's really look at it.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah.
The problem with that is that you would expect to see a wound from that angle, which if he's shooting from that angle, it'll probably come out more of the side of the president's head. Well, maybe that matches what Warren Report folks are saying, but where's the entry wound? Is there an entry wound over here somewhere? I mean, there's no evidence of anyone seeing that. By the way, there's 3 people who are on the record saying there was an entry wound right here, right above the president's hairline on the top right side of his head, including the mortician who prepared the body, who said that he had to put wax in the hole. Right?
Wow.
So Tom Robinson from Gawler's Funeral Home. So yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot.
There would be an addition to another wound. I think it was in one of the autopsy reports of the initial that he was shot in the back, an entry, and in the neck, and in the head. So it's
Well,
almost like you got hit by bullets.
Yeah,
bullets.
right. Yeah. So, but on the Secret Service thing, I mean, it comes down to that they're not going to cover it up. If it was a Secret Service agent, perhaps they would not, and it was an accident. It could be proven that it was an accident. Perhaps they wouldn't have served their whole life in prison. You know what I mean? Perhaps they just would have, their name would have been mud or whatever. But I don't think the government would go to the extent to help anybody for an accident ever. Right. I think they
it
would.
Doesn't account for the other bullets too. It doesn't account for
the other bullets, and it also doesn't account for all of these weird spycraft things that are happening in all these places. Yeah. Like all the weird things that are happening all over the place.
There were other Oswalds, like in Chicago, Miami. There were maybe other attempts on his life.
Other Oswalds, meaning there were other people who were potentially in a position to be a patsy.
Much well said.
And these things are all disputed, by the way. But that would be Thomas Valley in Chicago and a guy named Policarpo Lopez in Tampa.
Right. There's articles about them too. Like they were seeded into newspaper articles as trouble, they're dangerous, or something about them. I have to go back and look, but that's like in addition to all the 20 Oswald sightings and like that, it's like just so much strange intel stuff going on. It's really off the charts. But Matt, we are at the 56 minute. What can people look forward to on your second season of Solving JFK on the podcast?
Yeah, what we'll do is actually one of the first things I'm going to do is talk about Paul Landis. Out of the gate, he's the Secret Service agent who claims that he found the magic bullet on the back of the car, and then he put it on the stretcher. So I actually had a chance to interview him briefly in Pittsburgh, and I'll share my views on him, which I think are probably not what a lot of people would expect them to be. And then in the next episode, I have a little report from the 60th anniversary conference, which is kind of neat because we get sort of a lot of interviews with a lot of different interesting people. I got Alec Baldwin and Rob Reiner in that, and and conspiracy folks. I got Josiah Thompson and Doug Horn, so that'll be cool. And then the season, once we really get going here, we look at Oswald as a kid. We go all the way back to the beginning. Who was Oswald really? We look at him as a kid. We look at his time in the Marines. We look at his going to the Soviet Union and what was he doing over there. We look at his life when he got back, when he first went to Dallas and got a job there and started to meet Ruth Payne and all these people, and then went to New Orleans. What was he doing when he was in New Orleans? And then again, this whole conversation about going to Mexico City. Did he go to Mexico City or was that somebody else? What's the evidence say? And then, when he got back to Dallas, what was he up to? And following him all the way. And then also looking at impersonations, ties to intelligence, and, when did he first start following communism, and when did he learn how to speak Russian, and all of those kind of fun things. We talk about Ruth Payne and George de Mohrenschildt, and Guy Bannister, David Ferry, Sergio Arcacha Smith. Remember that name? Probably the main Cuban exile. Before I started my study of this season, I didn't appreciate. I always think of Antonio Vecchiana because he's the guy that says he saw Oswald with Maurice Bishop or David Atlee Phillips, but really Sergio Arcacha Smith is the main connector between if there was a plot for elements of the CIA or folks working out of Guy Bannister's office, David Ferry, to kill Kennedy. That plot involved Sergio Arcacha Smith, so he's a big name.
Big name, cool. Well, I'm looking forward to it, and I will put links to all these book, documentary, and podcast in the show notes. But again, thanks so much for your time, Matt. Matt Crumpton.
Yeah, thank you.
Solving
JFK
Brian. Podcast. Great job. Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for having me on, man.
And people can contact you through, do you have like a website or social media if they have any?
Yeah. I'm on Twitter is the easiest way to reach me. I'm the most responsive on Twitter because that's kind of where I live my life. I'm also on Instagram, TikTok a little bit, YouTube I'm on, but I don't really interact. Facebook, same thing. I'm on there as well. And then Solving JFK podcast at .com for all the transcripts and sources. You can see the citations behind all of my propositions of fact, and that's pretty much it.
Cool. So the website's there too. So I'll put that in there. And it's again Matt Crumpton, Crumpton of the Solving JFK podcast. Thanks so much.
Yes, sir. Thanks, William. Appreciate you, man.
Stay there. Appreciate you.